The Dead Spot in the Garden, written and read by Christopher Halton. The large gnarled oak in Campion's Field twisted against the wind, its partially exposed roots haunched like pincers, gripping the thinning soil. The tree was dying. On one side, where the bark had lifted, the wood beneath lay cracked and grey, and several branches above, stretching like skeletal fingers, were leafless and dead. It had stood thus for many years and had served the vengeance of men, hanging from its strong boughs, thieves, murderers, and witches. None could say how many souls had departed from those branches, for the tree's age reached beyond living memory, and further still than the recollection of their forebears. Yet the oak knew and had fed well upon what was returned to it, in hasty, unmarked graves. Even on the brightest days there lingered a heaviness beneath its canopy, and few were willing to rest there for shade or shelter, however fierce the sun or sudden the rain. And so it remained, alone, aloof, and faintly vengeful. That was until, on a night of violent storm, a crack of thunder and a white fork of lightning struck the old oak and split it from crown to root, setting its dry heart to flame. By morning it stood blackened and riven, as though opened by some tremendous force from within. Those who claimed to have watched from distant windows later spoke of sounds carried on the wind, not merely the snapping of timber, but something thinner, almost human. A few even insisted that in the shifting blaze they saw shapes rise through the sparks and vanish into the darkness above. Whether this was trickery of light and terror, or something long confined finally released, none could say. But after that night, the air about Campion's Field felt altered, and the place never seemed entirely empty again. And on that storm-riven night in 1767, the oak vanished from the landscape, and in time from recollection, as the land was turned to crops and hedged about in orderly fashion. Now and then the plough would strike something resistant, and the tines, lifting, would draw from the soil the pale suggestion of a human bone, a matter briefly remarked upon, then quietly set aside. By 1910 the nearby village of Caresworth had crept outward, its old boundaries quietly absorbed, and the former fields divided into plots. Streets were set out in tidy regimental lines, and large detached houses of red brick rose where the plough had once turned the soil. The prosperous Markhams were among this new company of wealthy middle-class families, each determined to fashion a house befitting their ascent. 5 or 6 bedrooms at least, ample rooms for dining and entertaining, and a discreet pair set aside for live-in servants. Such were the modest expectations of those who had known poverty and now claimed comfort and respectability as their due. For the Markhams, the house was more than shelter. It was visible proof of arrival, and so the first bricks were laid the following year. Unlike their neighbours, however, their foundations were delayed when bones were uncovered in the trenches. The police were summoned, and the matter referred to the coroner, who concluded that the fragments were human and of considerable age, perhaps 3 centuries or more. After a brief interruption, the ground was declared fit for building, and the work resumed. From March until November, the builders toiled, carpenters shaped and fitted, and the various trades completed their careful tasks. By late autumn, the house stood finished, and Robert and Joanna Markham, with their 2 children, Alex and Adrian, took up residence, attended by a modest domestic staff. It was said to be a happy house. Their children, aged 5 and 6, were enrolled at a private school. Joanna joined the local branch of the Women's Institute and quickly became a popular member, often inviting new acquaintances back for afternoon tea. Robert in turn joined the recently opened golf club. To outward appearance, all was comfortable and well ordered, yet in ways not immediately remarked upon, something in the atmosphere of the house had begun, almost imperceptibly, to alter. At first, the disturbances were trivial. Petty disagreements among the staff, small resentments over duties once performed without complaint. The gardener observed, with mild irritation, that in a certain area of the grounds nothing would take root however diligently the soil was turned. And there was, too, a vague unease, not attached to any particular event, but felt at odd moments, as though something just out of sight had shifted beneath the surface of their ordered lives. The children, both inclined toward the elaborate inventions of youth, spoke frequently of a smiling old woman who stood at the far end of the garden, watching them at play. She never approached or spoke. At other times they mentioned a small companion who joined them in the nursery, a quiet playmate who took part in their games but was invariably gone before bedtime. Robert and Joanna regarded these accounts with indulgent amusement. Children imagined such things, and since neither apparition inspired fear or distress, there seemed no cause for concern. Gradually, however, the temper of the house seemed to shift. Joanna became increasingly aware of a subtle oppression within it, not tied to any single room or occurrence, but present all the same. She mentioned this to Robert, who was often absent, occupied with his textile business or detained at the golf club, in the easy sociability of professional acquaintances. He listened patiently, but found nothing tangible to support her unease. The servants, too, appeared unsettled. Several left without a clear reason, and replacements seldom remained long. When pressed, none could articulate a complaint beyond vague discomfort. Robert remained unconcerned. Like the children's invisible companions, he attributed it all to imagination and the natural adjustments of a household finding its rhythm. Matters altered irrevocably when the children's pet rabbit, Lucy, was discovered suspended from the garden arbour, a fine length of twine drawn cruelly tight about its neck. How it came to be there was never satisfactorily explained. The discovery was made by the gardener, a reserved fellow named Simpkins, and the unpleasant business was dealt with before the children were aware of its particulars. They were told only that Lucy had died, and accepted this explanation with the resilient simplicity of youth. Though spared the particulars by Simpkins, the children later confided that their unseen playmate, Callie, had told them Lucy had been taken by the old woman who watched from the far end of the garden. They spoke of it matter-of-factly, as children recount shared secrets, and pointed without hesitation to the same neglected corner where nothing would grow. Joanna found this coincidence unsettling. What had once seemed a childish invention now carried an uncomfortable persistence. She mentioned it again to Robert, who, though troubled by the manner of the rabbit's death, remained convinced that some trespasser had entered the grounds under cover of darkness, and committed a cruel act for reasons best left unexplored. As winter gave way to spring, and spring in turn to the first warmth of summer, life within the house proceeded with an appearance of normality. Nothing further occurred that might be called remarkable. Indeed, it seemed for a time as though the house had settled into an uneasy accommodation with the land upon which it stood, land that many years before had borne the weight of the old oak. That sense of equilibrium was disturbed one bright afternoon when Joanna, while straightening the cushions in the lounge, became aware, or believed she became aware, of a figure passing beyond the open French windows. It was only a fleeting impression, the outline of an elderly woman moving slowly across the garden, her shape momentarily defined against the glare of sunlight before dissolving back into it. A faint coldness touched her, but mastering herself, Joanna opened the doors and stepped onto the flagged patio. The garden lay empty. Only the insistent chatter of birds disturbed the air. She told herself it had been a trick of light and movement, nothing more. Yet a small, persistent unease resisted dismissal. Apart from a single maid, Joanna found herself alone in the house for much of the afternoon, and she counted the hours until Robert's return. and the lively voices of the children at tea. That evening, over claret, she recounted what she had seen, or thought she had seen, and could not help but compare it with the children's earlier accounts. Robert listened attentively, though with a faint smile of scepticism. "My dear," he said gently, "a quiet house can play curious tricks upon the mind. You have had the children's stories in your thoughts, and it is only natural that your imagination should lend them substance. Had there been anyone in the garden, Simpkins would surely have noticed. He was close enough to the house at the time." "Surely you must concede," Joanna said quietly, "that there is something unsettled here. Your not having seen it does not render my own experience less certain." Robert smiled as he drained his glass. "If I observe anything amiss, my dear, you shall be the first informed." The matter was left there. As the year inclined toward early autumn, a sharper wind began to move through the trees and shrubs, and the first frost nipped at the leaves, sending a brittle scattering across the lawn. Joanna could not say why, but the change of season seemed to deepen the house's peculiar stillness. It was not fear she felt precisely, only the quiet sense that something long dormant had begun to stir. Simpkins was the first to observe it, crude lettering scored into the outer wall of his gardening shed, which stood, for convenience, upon the very patch where nothing would grow. The words read simply, "Annie Dawkins, 1675. Irritated by the damage, he informed Joanna and Robert, who were taking tea in the lounge over their morning papers. They attended at once. The markings appeared to have been made with the point of a knife or some similar blade. "How very odd," murmured Robert. "Who would trouble themselves to come here for such a purpose?" The young constable examined the carving for some moments before speaking. "I cannot imagine anyone local wishing to cause such damage, sir," he said carefully. "But the name itself is not entirely unfamiliar in these parts." Robert glanced at him. "In what sense?" The officer removed his helmet and shifted it beneath his arm. "There were, some centuries ago, a small number of women tried at the assizes on charges of witchcraft. Annie Dawkins was among them, perhaps the first named in the record. It was said she also stood accused in connection with the disappearance of a child. The details are uncertain. Parish gossip mostly." He paused. "The matter is long past, of course." The constable accepted a cup of tea from the maid before taking his leave, remarking that he would keep the matter in mind in case it proved some ill-conceived jest, though by whom or to what end he could not suggest. Some days later, Joanna noticed faint pencil markings upon the lower panelling of the nursery wall, half concealed behind a small table. At first she dismissed them as idle scribblings, circles intersected by short strokes, and a repeated figure resembling a crude wheel or star. When she gently questioned the children, they showed neither evasiveness nor disturbance. "Callie showed us," Alex said simply. "He said it keeps things safe." A faint coldness passed through Joanna. "Safe from what?" she asked. Adrian glanced toward the window before replying. "From her." Looking from the nursery window down into the rear grounds, Joanna became aware of a figure standing near the gardener's hut. This time there was no mistaking the outline. An elderly woman clad in dark, ill-kept garments, her hair hanging in long streaked strands about her shoulders. Even at that distance, there was something in the stillness of her posture that suggested hostility. Or perhaps it was only the force of Joanna's own apprehension that lent the impression. The woman did not move. She stood very close to the shed. Though reluctant, Robert resolved that the shed should be moved and the ground beneath examined. He enlisted the help of a friend from the golf club, Duncan Scriver, who had some experience of antiquarian excavations, and together with 2 labourers they began to turn the compacted earth just days before the winter frost was due. At a depth of some 5 feet the spade met resistance. It was not a stone, nor root. What emerged first was iron, deeply corroded, twisted upon itself, and fused into the surrounding soil as though it had long resisted removal. The shape suggested a fastening of some kind, though no one present could say for certain what it had once secured. Beneath it the earth darkened. Fragments of bone were uncovered, some unmistakably human, others smaller and difficult to distinguish in the failing light. They did not form a complete arrangement. No clear outline of burial presented itself. The ground appeared disturbed and reworked, as though whatever had once lain there had not been left in peace. A bitter wind rose before the pit could be cleared further, and by morning the frost hardened the exposed soil. Scriver advised postponement until spring. By the time milder weather returned, the excavation had partially collapsed, and the Markhams, weary of speculation, chose not to pursue it further. The shed was not replaced on that patch. Nothing would grow there still. And though the children ceased speaking of Callie, and no further figure was seen in the garden, that area of the garden remained a darkened circle long after the frost had lifted, as if the earth itself retained a memory of what it had once been asked to conceal. The end. And so we leave the Markhams, and that darkened circle in the lawn, undisturbed and hopefully forgotten to time and circumstance. I hope you've enjoyed this evening's tale. I continue to write stories in this strange and unsettling vein, and if you would like to read more of my work, you'll find my collections available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle editions. Thank you for listening, and until the next time.